Welcome to the Mill Course, Troublemaker for Justice. If you haven't received your book, this is what it looks like. Today we'll be examining his identities and challenges. So, meet your instructors. I'll let Lillie go first.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm very excited for this opportunity to talk about Bayard Rustin. I am retired as a professor from Drew University, and I have been doing since my retirement in 2016 public history like this, being able to talk to and work with various communities around Montclair and Essex County.
And hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Bianca Mays. I am the Health and Wellness Coordinator of Garden State Equality, which is a statewide LGBTQ organization. I am also an adjunct professor at Monmouth University, and I'm really excited to be here today. So I'm going to move us on forward. Just some Zoom housekeeping, and this is the time to ask any more questions that you specifically have about Zoom. So it's best before you all speak to mute yourself. This way, any kind of background noise that's around you, truck drivers, cars passing, fuzzy pets and animals, we won't be able to hear it while we're presenting. It's better to have earbuds or headphones in. So if you have them, go ahead and grab them. You can also raise your hand in the chat if you have a question. That's a really good way to notify us. Jennifer says she can't see us speaking. So Jennifer, if you're seeing my screen. Yes, that's correct. So you're seeing my screen. That's why you're not able to see our faces, because we have some visual guides to help us as we navigate through the course. If you're having any trouble with Zoom, just put it in the chat so we can help you. If you don't want to be on screen, you can stop your video. That's a really good idea if you want to use the restroom or if you want to grab some coffee or some water. And if by accident a host drops out, just stay logged into Zoom and we'll be able to sign back in. And that's in case we lose any kind of internet connectivity. So here's our outline for the course for today. We're going to talk about marginalization. We have an activity for you around social identities and intersectionality. We are going to be talking about LGBTQ and race because that was a big part of his life, right? And really what shapes him as a person. And then we're going to talk about family and community institutions and how that played a part into his decision-making, his mindset, etc. And then for the following two courses, we'll be looking at societal constructions and broader contexts. So speaking of different identities that people usually think of, right? We have our social identities, and these are our big nine, right? So I remember a person saying that they were disabled. That's an example of a social identity. Your age, a few people stated that you can't tell that they're older, your class, ethnicity, gender, language, race, religion, and sexual orientation, right? These are what most people think of when it comes to the identity piece. But there are also different pieces of identity that are social identities that also count too, right? So language, where you are geographically, right? Your learning style and behavior, things that you believe in, like religion or politics or social ideas, any kind of appearance that someone has, and even their body language, right? These are also social identities that can be used to define people, anyone really, throughout and I think for some of these identities, they also, ground us in our upbringing and who we actually are as people. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to our identities, we know that these identities can also belong in different kinds of groups that are a part of our culture. But it's important that we are able to look at and acknowledge the other kinds of values and cultures within groups and making sure that we are looking at things in an intersectional kind of view instead of non-intersectionality. So for those of you that I'm going to walk you through the concepts of intersectionality. So looking at our identities, right? The identities, the big nine that we had on the previous slide, I use this activity called concentric circles. So using those categories, think to yourself about your own identities, right? Your outer identity is the identity that you think about the least. Your middle identity is an identity that you think about maybe from time to time. And then your center identity is something that you think about all the time, right? And when we're thinking about our own concentric circles, for everyone, it's going to be completely different, right? So, example for myself is my outer identity would be my sexual orientation. I don't think about my sexual orientation whatsoever. Why? Probably because I work in an LGBTQ organization. My friends and family all know about my fiance, so I don't have to think about that part of my identity. My middle identity is that I am middle class. I grew up born and raised in New Jersey. I was born in Summit, New Jersey, which is a pretty affluent area. So I never really had to think about my class for the most part, or how certain things that happen in this country might affect me financially. So I think about it sometimes, but it doesn't drive me as much as my center identity, right? And my center identity is actually my race. So I'm Black, which is something that I think about all the time because of the different environments that I've been in. In my previous work experience, sometimes I have been the only Black person in the room. Where I live in New Jersey, there aren't a lot of people that look like me. So I think about my race more often than any other identity because I'm always reminded, depending on where I am, that there aren't that many people that look like me in the space that I'm at. But if you are able to, use those identities yourself from the previous slide, think about what your outer, middle, and center concentric circles might be. And if you want, you can feel free to write them what they might be in the chat, or if you want, you can say them now, what you might think your outer, middle, and center could be.
And you may also realize that if you want to do this exercise on your own, do more of it later, think about how those circles have also changed and shifted with age and experience, with context that I would say I didn't, I thought about race very differently growing up as a kid in Columbus, Georgia, versus being at uber progressive liberal Oberlin in college, or Montclair, those two spaces, and very differently working at Drew and going to Madison, New Jersey every day. Only a few miles away from Montclair, but a completely different context in which my circles shifted, right? Anyone else want to share?
Yeah. If you feel so comfortable sharing, of course.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be, even if you're not really sure which one would be outer, middle, or center, which of the identities really stuck out to you?
Listening to you, it reminded me of the great difference there is in just in race, because being white, I never think about it. And so I think that's because of the privilege we have of being white in this society. So that's one thing that I never even think about. And I don't know if I'm the only person that way, or if a lot of whites are also in that same position.
I agree.
I agree.
I agree
with Emily.
Yeah, that's my outer identity as well.
I had I had a unique experience when I worked at Winston-Salem State University. As I mentioned, that was an HBCU, and I was a minority white in a majority Black environment, often the only white person at a meeting, even among the advancement group within which I worked. I was the only white person, so it was a great experience for me to be immersed in that situation, to understand how my African American friends and communities in New Jersey or anywhere must feel to be the minority in a majority white arena. Very interesting. It was a reverse, and I grew up with a dad who was a jazz musician, and in Caldwell, as I mentioned, and we always had. I mean, his best friend was an African American man, a wonderful his best friend. So I grew up with and among African American friends and of the family. But it was a whole different experience when I went to North Carolina, and also that I was Italian, as they would say. I mean, there was like, I looked different, I sounded different. I thought everybody else had an accent, but in terms of the Black-white experience, it was really eye-opening for me. I learned so much from that experience.
I have to say, I grew up here in Nutley. Race never came into my thoughts because Nutley has, and still does, is not a very diversified community. So I never really thought about race. But the other thing that I did think about, Nutley again not being too diverse, I'm Jewish. And in Nutley, people were basically Catholic, Protestant, very few Jewish people. And when it came, say, to the Jewish holidays, so to speak, like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, I was the only one who wasn't in school. I was the only one who did something different. So that was a very interesting time in my young days for that, because I did feel kind of left out. Everybody else was of a different religion. So I did want to share that.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, it's Sandra. I'm finding it very interesting to hear the commentary, excuse me, about one person sharing about being white and working in a predominantly Black environment, which is woo, great for you, because I think work calls us to do what we do. In my career as an educator, I was a special education teacher, but I wound up working in pretty much all white school districts. And my motivation was my calling, if you will, to work with children who had handicaps. But as I've gotten older and begun to talk about these issues on race and so forth, I can't help but share this notion of white privilege and white persons who have the ability to fluidly go through different environments and places without even having to really think twice about it. It's almost like, I guess what I'm trying to say is that for a short time, you can share the other experience, but the overarching protections of being white and the privileges of being white still remain for you. So I just wanted to share that because there are people now who are trying to bring to the forefront more understanding about whiteness and what it really means, as opposed to the life traumas and loss and denials that Blacks experience on a moment by moment basis. And we don't get to escape and go away. It's always with us.
Yeah.
That's a really good point to bring up. Thank you. It's a really good observation. And we're going to talk about that as we move forward with different identities that you're right, you know, you can't necessarily escape from. You're always going to be thinking of it, or people might always be reminding you that you are different, right? That you are outside of societal norms or outside of societal expectations, to say the least, for certain identities that you may hold as a person. So,
And please, can I just share this? I really do appreciate the sharing. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to deny anybody's experience. I'm just trying to be an advocate of the realities of our society. It still has these oppressive ways, and Black people have continuously been the oppressed. And we can talk about movement, progress, and so forth, but we haven't resolved the issue of the oppression of Blacks in the society.
absolutely.
I can't believe I got that deep. Sorry.
No, please do not apologize.
I'm sorry.
Good.
We're gonna keep it on the light side, but I mean, that's just my heart.
I don't think it's possible to have a study that focuses on Bayard Rustin and all that he did and meant to human rights,
Yes.
and avoid going deep, because he's
Yes.
truly a deep brother.
Yes.
Yes.
He is.
So that is a space I think we will be in for the next 3 weeks.
Yes.
And it's a good
Yes.
space. It's a good space.
Yeah, it's a good space. So please don't feel bad.
Yeah.
We are going to get into that space, and that's why I think it's important that we talk about the identities piece, but we also talk about the intersectionality piece, right? And for those of you that aren't familiar with intersectionality, this term was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's an attorney. She's a professor. She basically, you know, founded this term where it talks about specifically the sociological theory where you describe multiple threads of discrimination when an individual identifies, their identities, overlap with a number of minority classes. Now, so identities and intersectionality, it could be different identities that exist in a person, right? So if we're looking at Rustin, not only was he Black, but he was also Black and gay. He was Black and from the South. All of these identities that we have here, all these identities in these concentric circles are all intersecting together, right? If I asked you, pull apart your identities and I want you to put the most important identity first, would you be able to do it? And say that all of your actions, all of your thought process, everything that you are only comes from one of those identities?
No.
Probably not, right? You probably would not be able to do that. And so it's important that when we're looking at someone's life, when we're critiquing the systematic things that are in place here in this country and historically in religion, in anything that we are doing as a society, that we're looking through it with the lens of people having different identities that can shape how they think about things, shape what they do, what they write, the songs they listen to, how important certain people in their life are or movements are in their life. And that's why it's not only just him being Black, it's him being Black in America during this time. It's him being Black and gay in America in this time, right? It's him being Black and gay and a Quaker in America during this time, right? Like all of these identities, we have to be able to acknowledge them throughout each part of his life and each part of the book, because each piece of it is why he made the decisions that he did.
Right.
So we are going to get,
they're all informing his values, his own identity of how he identifies himself, right? And definitely they shape how he engages the world. And we know that that engagement, because of the multiple identities intersecting, he has multiple challenges that are ongoing. You know, there is no, as Sandra, I think, was saying, there's no respite for him where he can, you know, take a day off from his identities and the challenges that they bring. And he is especially important, I think, because he does not hide or run away from the intersectionalities of who. So he is very affirming and saying, I am all these things, as opposed to using one to hide the other. We don't mention it here, but we should think about the fact that he is, in the context of Black community in particular, in the early part of the 20th century, his family is very middle class, if not affluent in Westchester, not just in terms of the status that the family has, but, you know, financially. They're living in a 10-room house.
Wow.
Right.
would still be affluent, right? Kind of.
Yeah. A 10-room house and taking in visitors and feeding them, right? Not.
Right. And his mother/grandmother, right, Ma Rustin, she wasn't just a member of the NAACP, she was a founding member, a charter member, right? And so the kind of standing in community even was very important to his sense of self and identity. In some ways, they were privileged.
Yeah.
Right? They were privileged as Black people at the turn of the century to live a middle class lifestyle in the middle of Jim Crow, Pennsylvania.
That's a good point. Thank you, Lillie. So we wanted to unpack more about the intersectionality piece and how it basically highlights who he is as a person and his individual voice, and how it helped him become a better leader, looking at all pieces of his identity and the bigger picture of understanding who he actually is, and how he shapes himself over time. So just looking at some of the other intersectionality pieces, looking at, you know, as Lillie was saying, you know, he was affluent. He believes specifically with his Quaker roots in, you know, not nonviolence, and how that shaped how he decided to move the civil rights movement forward nonviolently, right? Identifying himself even within Black spaces, you know, because obviously there's different religions in the Black community, making him different as a Black Quaker versus Martin Luther King and other established Black men who were in part in different religions like Christianity. You know, he brought in eventually a few people from different religions through his movement, focusing on the bigger picture of looking at the civil rights movement. And so we want to talk about marginalization, because that's also a piece of your social identity, right? So it's basically a process that keeps people, individuals, or groups from being able to fully participate in society, whether that's socially, economically, or politically, right? And throughout his life, he will experience marginalization in different ways. So here are some examples on how we as individuals, or we as a society as a whole, might be marginalizing people with different identities, right? So bullying people, not providing equal access to resources specifically because of someone's identity, denying them professional opportunities based off of someone's identity, right? Or assuming, or stereotypes, right? Stereotypes and assuming that someone's going to act a certain way because of their identity, right? So Rustin specifically chose nonviolent approach because he thought that the police and this country would associate his Blackness with violence. Right? And that specifically is something that he was aware of. And he was also marginalized specifically because of his sexual orientation, because of him being gay. And this is a podcast. Lillie, do you know how to, let me see, here we go. So this is a podcast from Making Gay History, which features more an interview that he did. Oh, I need permission. Why do I need permission? Okay, so I requested permission to play it, but I'm not sure if it's gonna happen in time. So I'm just gonna go past that. And if we can in a future class, I'll be able to play that for you. I apologize. So I'm gonna go into the LGBTQ piece of this because this is a big part of his life, and his sexual orientation provided him opportunity, but it also has taken away opportunity throughout his life. Right, so this is just an LGBTQ overview as a whole. So for people, we have three main areas that help shape who we are. So when people think of the LGBTQ acronym, a lot of times people assume that the LGBTQ piece all is sexual orientation, but it's actually sexual orientation and gender identity along one spectrum. So you have your sex assigned at birth. So this is biological characteristics that show up when you're born, right? This is something that you have no influence over. You're just born this way. It's embedded inside of your chromosomes, right? So when people are born, do we biologically test people, genetically test people to see if they're male, female, or intersex? Or do we just naturally look at someone's genitalia and assume male or female? We just look at people, right? When you're born, we're not chromosomally testing you on the spot. We're looking to see what kind of genitalia a person has. However, there are people that are born with the chromosomal and hormonal combinations of both male and female at the same time. So the older terminology for this word was hermaphrodite. Are any of you familiar with that term? You've heard it before?
Oh, yeah.
I'm seeing some nodding. So that's the old terminology. We don't say that anymore. So the term now that we use for people that are born with male and female genitalia, chromosomes, and hormones, we use the term intersex. And it's actually really common. About 1 in 100 people born in this country are actually intersex. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. And unfortunately, in the past, when people are born as intersex, sometimes doctors will perform corrective surgery on newborn infants to give them the gender of either male or female. And actually, in most states in the United States, it's actually still legal to do that.
Really? Wow.
Yes, and unfortunately, sometimes in the past, doctors have not been forward with parents about people that were born with an intersex condition. So sometimes when people were born, doctors would say, I don't know what this baby is. We're just going to snip something off a little bit here. Maybe it's a cancer growth, right? When really there was nothing wrong with the child. So if you want some more information about intersex identities, you can definitely, I'll give you all my email because I have a whole separate presentation. But to move forward, your sex assigned at birth is different than your gender, right? Your gender is a social construct that we all participate in, right? It's how we learn to walk, how we talk. It's how we learn what careers you might have chosen over your life, right? What kind of clothes you might wear, how you learn to be a man or a woman in this society. And it can change over time, right? There was a time where if you express your gender, so your gender expressions are what you wear, your speech, and your clothes, there was a time where women were not allowed to wear pants,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
You could have
True.
been arrested for wearing pants, right?
Mm.
But now I'm sure most of us have on pants right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that's an example of your gender expression changing over time, and it can be dependent on your culture or your history. And then we have your gender identity, and that's your internal belief that I am a woman, I am a man. I don't like either one of those options, right? For some people, they feel that they're both man and woman. This is basically internal, right? This is what makes you feel like yourself. And then we have your sexual orientation, which is your romantic and sexual attraction towards another person. So when it
Bianca,
comes to,
oh, I
yes,
was, oh, I guess this is going to explain it, but I've always had a problem and I need some education on the Q.
yes, we're going to get
Because,
to that.
okay,
Right
good,
now.
good.
It's
All
right
right.
here.
Okay.
All right, so we are going to get to that Q. So this is the LGBTQ acronym.
Mhm.
The acronym goes much further than this. However, I keep it here because this pretty much covers majority of people in the community. One of the questions I'm always getting is, Bianca, why are there so many letters? I thought first it was T, then we're adding Q, then we're adding other things. Great question. The reason why the acronym keeps growing is because you have different generations of people all trying to relate on one spectrum. And the LGBT, those words have been around longer, and they were
Mhm.
actually created by people that were not in the community.
Mm.
So everything from Q to P to the plus are words
Mhm.
that the community came up with themselves. And
Okay.
everything else that's prior to that was actually made by people that are not LGBT. So I'm going to run through them all. So a lesbian is just a woman attracted to another woman. Gay is a male attracted to another male. Bisexual means that you're attracted to both men and women. We have the T here for transgender. So that just means that anyone whose sex assigned at birth is the opposite of their gender identity. So again, your sex assigned at birth, can't change that. But your gender identity for trans people, it feels the opposite of whatever the doctor told their parents or guardian at birth. Oh, Brenda says about the pants. Yeah, that's why it's important that we look at the historical piece of how laws are put in place that can determine people's gender expression and their ability to be a part of this community or wear what they want. So we have the first Q, which stands for queer. This is a very interesting term, right?
Mm.
And people always ask me, Bianca, what does queer actually mean? Because I remember it being used derogatively, right?
Yes.
Don't be
Yep.
like those queers.
Could people put themselves on mute if they're not speaking? I'm just getting
Thank
a
you.
lot of feedback on my side. If you could put yourself on mute if you're not speaking, sorry.
No, it's okay. Don't apologize. Yeah, so if you could put yourself on mute, that would be very helpful. So yes, the word queer means different things to different people, right? When I talk to people in my job that might be from older generations, they remember this term being used derogatively, very negatively, right? You would not want to be called a queer. But if I'm hanging out with different kinds of people and they might be from younger generations, queer could mean to be different, to be outside of societal norms, to be, inclusive. When it comes to the community, queer is actually a very large umbrella that encaptures all of these other identities. So if you are lesbian, technically you are queer. If you're bisexual, you are queer. It just depends on how you feel about the term. But I always tell people, if you are not in the LGBTQ community, this is probably not a term that I would use if I were you, because it brings up different emotions for people, right? And we want to make sure that we will be careful about being respectful to other people. You never know how this is going to make people feel. So if you're not in the community, definitely something to just know about and educate yourself about, but I wouldn't move forward with using it openly unless you know the person you're talking with specifically uses and likes that word. The second Q is just questioning. That means that you've questioned your sexual orientation and gender identity at some point in your life. The I is intersex, which I was talking about earlier, male and female combination of chromosomes and genitalia. And we have people that are allies. So A, people get confused sometimes by what the A is doing on this spectrum. To be an ally, all it means is that if you see someone say something homophobic, you'll stand up for that person, you'll advocate for LGBTQ rights. It does not mean that you are lesbian or gay or bisexual. It just means that you believe in LGBTQ rights and you support them actively. And then we have our P here, which stands for pansexual, and that's anyone that's someone that's attracted to any gender. It doesn't matter how a person identifies themselves, they will like that person for who they are. And then we have a plus because, again, it goes well beyond here, right? So then looking at homophobia as a whole, this country, along with other countries, has explicit and implicit homophobia. And we're going to go through some of that, right? So homophobia can exist as an individual, either implicit or explicitly. So explicit bias is what most people are familiar with, right? So I don't want to learn about gay people. Why are we talking about this? I don't think my children should learn about gay people, right? That's explicit. It's outward. You can identify it like that. But most people still have to work on their implicit bias, right? We all have biases. It's the little shortcuts in our brains that help us establish different patterns that we see. And we've learned our bias through history, through literature, through religion, family, friends, media plays a big part in it, right? You learn your biases from outside sources. And not all biases are bad, but it's something that we need to work on, right? Something that we can develop and shape over time. So your implicit bias might be feeling uneasy when you see a same-gender couple kiss. That might be an example of implicit bias, right? It's more internal. It's something that you acknowledge. You're trying to work on it. And that's something that we can be able to do. But then we also have bias. We also have homophobia in systems, right? So if we look at the picture that says homosexuality, that's homosexuality and the DSM. So this is basically a tool that's used to diagnose different mental disorders that people have had in the past. And homosexuality during this time was considered a sociopathic personality disturbance in 1952. People said that LGBTQ people were deviants, sexual deviants, or they had a sexual dysfunction, and it actually wasn't taken out of the DSM until 1994. And that's a very long time, right? And then even historically looking at the lavender scare. Have any of you heard about the lavender scare? So basically, President Eisenhower and his State Department basically identified people within the LGBTQ community as being a security risk to the government, right? And basically compared LGBTQ people to being communists, which during the 1950s is a very, very big thing to say about a community of people, right? Comparing them to communists, saying that communist countries were using LGBTQ people's sexual orientation and blackmailing them to spread communism throughout the United States. And then if you look here at the bottom where it's a picture of Stonewall, this is a bar in New York City that last year celebrated 50 years. So you might all be familiar with Pride that happens in New York City the last Saturday of June. There's like a big celebration outside and it pulls in thousands of people. But what most people don't understand is that the first Pride was actually a riot. It was actually illegal to be LGBTQ and be in bars and public spaces. You couldn't even show public displays of affection. And people were arrested. So the police actually came to the Stonewall Inn and were trying to raid the place, and the community actually fought the police back, and the streets filled with people rioting against the police and the brutality that they experienced during that time. And then I also included a map here because what most people don't understand is even after marriage equality and after the equal rights movement for the LGBTQ people, there's actually still this legal discrimination now. So if you look at this map of the United States, the dark green states are states that have protections against discriminating against LGBTQ people. But if you see a striped state, that means they only have protection for sexual orientation and not gender identity. So those states don't protect trans people. And then all the states that are beige color, those are all the states where you're legally able to discriminate against LGBTQ people for housing, for jobs, and for public accommodation. So let's say my fiance and I decided to go to one of these beige states, and when we get married, I put our wedding photo on my desk. If I'm in one of these states, I can be fired for that. If I go to one of these states, they can deny me housing and say, we don't want your kind of people living in this neighborhood. And it's completely legal. There are no federal protections for LGBTQ people. That's something that the Civil Rights Act actually does not include. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And this is from his own words, just battling with, being okay with his orientation, his sexual orientation. And just, this is a letter that he wrote to Platt. So if you're reading the book, he wrote this letter to Platt, but in those days, you had to code your letters in case someone else was reading it. So oftentimes he would make out his personal letters to a Marie, who was actually Platt, someone that he considered was romantically attracted to at the time, and they were together for a short bit. But he's saying that I must pray, trust, and experience, dream, hope, and all else possible until I know clearly in my own mind and spirit that I have failed to become heterosexual. If I must fail, not because of a faint heart or for lack of confidence in my true self, or for pride, or for emotional instability, for moral lethargy, or any other character fault, but rather because I come to see after the most complete searching that the best for me lies elsewhere. And, throughout his book, his sexual orientation was discussed a lot, right? He was criticized for his sexual orientation, criminalized for his sexual orientation. He was actually arrested because he was with another man, arrested in California, specifically because he was gay, right? His sexual orientation was weaponized. They actually wanted him to step back from becoming a leader in the civil rights movement because they were afraid that his arrests in California would be put in the paper, and they were put in the paper and publicized and associated with Dr. Martin Luther King. And they were actually going to release a paper saying that him and Rustin were romantically together, right? Think about if that were to have to happen, do you think that the March on Washington would have happened, right? Do you think the Civil Rights Act would have been signed? Probably not. There's many times where he actually had to step back because of his sexual orientation, and that one arrest, because that would have jeopardized the entire civil rights movement. And they also ostracized him because of it throughout his life, right? Even though he never hid his sexual orientation. He never hid it. He was proud of who he was. He didn't see his sexual orientation as a sin or anything negative. However, he was ready to push down that identity and pull himself away from the movement if it was going to hurt the larger vision of what everyone else had in mind. Kate says, I think it's interesting to think of the bias he experienced for his sexual orientation and to think how that persists. Absolutely. He didn't actually start advocating for LGBTQ rights until later on in his life.
Actually, I didn't mean for, I meant by for.
Oh, by
Yeah.
for. Got
Yeah,
it,
I
got
meant
it. Thank
for
you.
and by
Before.
for. But it's just interesting. My internet's bad, so I sometimes turn off the video just to keep the less interference with Zoom. And this has come up if you listen to the Rev Al Sharpton on MSNBC talking about prejudice within the religious African-American community toward Mayor Pete. Now, there are a lot of reasons that there may be problems with Mayor Pete, but when one of them was his sexual orientation,
Right.
not to me, but that was a perceived problem by some people. And I just think that's interesting. You can sort of just see the history and trajectory and how
Absolutely.
much has changed, but also how little has changed.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And even statistically speaking, unfortunately, Black churches are not the most accepting of LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
Right. When we're looking at other religious groups and other races, there's more. You're actually more able to be accepted if you are going to a white church.
Yeah.
Than if you are going to a Black church. Like think about like if you were to Google LGBTQ church in the state that you're in, there would probably be more white churches than more Black churches. So like even him being gay in the church is a completely different discussion. That in
Yes.
itself can be itself can be a whole other lecture.
Bianca, I'm so sorry I
masking.
have to leave the meeting to go to a Rotary meeting, but I enjoyed this so much and I look forward to next week. So please pardon me.
That's okay. Thank you.
That's okay.
Brenda, it's Sandra again. Do you have any insight as to, I know some of the history on Blacks and the gay people in relation to being accepted, but from your studies and educational background, do you have any insights as to why that is, that there's more difficulty with Black churches accepting this community?
A lot of it, unfortunately, stems from colonialization. And I say this because every group that existed in the world has had LGBTQ people. In the original texts, they've all been there. Unfortunately, with colonialization and the Christian Crusaders, a lot of those original texts that highlighted LGBTQ people in different countries got destroyed. So for a lot of Black people in the church, they associate LGBTQ identities with whiteness. And they associate it with, because they're not able to identify it in their own culture. Like if we're looking at Polynesian cultures, we're looking at India. India's had a third gender for hundreds of years, but you're not able to find that many texts from the continent of Africa on LGBTQ identities. And then you have the Christian Crusaders and other religions coming into different countries in Africa and making it illegal to be LGBTQ. Laws that were not in place before they got there. Right? And then you have people being forced to take on a new religion, where if you were in Africa, in any country in Africa in the 1600s or the 1500s, your religion would not have included the demoralization of LGBTQ people. That's something that specifically came with Christianity and with different Christianity, the Muslim community, the Muslim, religion, and with the Catholic religion. That was all a part of that piece. You're looking at India, they have, and India actually, the third gender, if you are a third gender person in that space, you actually are seen as more spiritually relevant and seen to bless babies in because people think that your experience of male and female puts you higher than just the traditional male or female. Same thing with American Indian culture, the two-spirit culture. that was already in the Americas. And when, you know, Columbus and everyone else came over, people that identified as two-spirit were killed, and a religion was forced upon them that they did not believe, but they had to adopt it because they didn't have a choice. So unfortunately for the Black church, a lot of the homophobia is because we don't have a lot of texts and cultural references of LGBTQ people in those countries because they were destroyed. And a lot of the religious beliefs that the Black church held is because historically of slavery, right? Not giving people a choice in the kind of religion that they want to believe, and then making sure that that religion weaponizes LGBTQ people and makes them criminals in that same light. And I don't know, Lillie, if you wanna speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that, and it's something that is on a later slide, but I'll bring it up now. And it has to do with what scholars call the politics of respectability. And so part of the weight, as you can imagine, on any people who are marginalized, who are identified as being inherently, innately, biologically inferior, is to in fact prove that you are not, to prove your humanity, to prove your worth, to prove your equality. And that translates into an effort to be respectable, the exercise we did in the beginning about what you look like and how you are perceived. It resonates in terms of COVID-19, and immediately with the whole idea of wearing masks, Black men say, I can't wear a mask, because for me to wear a mask is to validate that I am a dangerous person, which people already assume. Mm-hmm. And so a politics of respectability evolves, especially in the Black church, and especially at HBCUs. And Diane, you can probably attest to this, in terms of how you dress, how you carry yourself, mm-hmm. how you speak. It becomes internalized into the Black community, and it's kind of expectations of each other, because one Black person, defines the entire race.
Absolutely.
And, right.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
At Morehouse, is there or at Morehouse and at Spelman together, do they have an LGBTQ, any kind of, I don't know, affinity group, or is that allowed? I mean, I understand you're not teaching there, you were a Jew, but that's on college. The reason why I'm asking, actually, one reason is I'm a college counselor, and mm-hmm. that's something that, you know, isn't relevant to many kids. It's a total aside. You could just tell me later. It's not important, but I was curious about that.
Bianca, you may remember there was an incident at Morehouse fairly recently where the institution mm-hmm. came out in support, right?
Yeah.
Of its LGBTQ. It's a gay student. Do you recall?
Yeah, so because of the historical background of both Spelman and Morehouse, right? Mm-hmm. They traditionally were only accepting cisgender men and cisgender women. So when a transgender student wanted to come to Morehouse, they were looking at the traditional values of the school and saying, you know, this is not appropriate, right. You know, we're not going to allow this. And so the historically Black universities were then becoming critiqued, because when you look at the list of LGBTQ safe colleges throughout the United States, and this is actually something that exists, there is no HBCU on that list. Even Montclair State in New Jersey is on that list as being one of the most LGBTQ friendly universities in the country. But there is no HBCU university on that list. And the reasoning could be, there might not be an actual affinity group on those campuses that exist from the university side, but the students might make something to protect themselves and to have a social group together. But in terms of the university, the university has been trying to catch up with the times of being more inclusive and looking at what Blackness is, right? Because there's even discussions and debates in the Black community of, can you be all for the Black movement and LGBTQ? That in itself is its own argument, because there are people that say being LGBTQ is dangerous to the Black community because it's used to say, oh, it's taking apart the Black family, right? It's taking away Black values because you're not having kids, because you're not raising them right. The same language around sexual perversion still exists in the Black community when talking about LGBTQ people. And that's what some of the issue is. And unfortunately, in religious communities in the Black community, there aren't a lot of religious leaders that are stepping up and saying this is an affirming church. So that also further perpetuates that kind of stereotype and notion.
Yeah, and it just occurred to me we should connect it also to the kind of patriarchal hierarchy within Black institutions. This doesn't mean Black women, for example, aren't the majority of people in historically Black churches, right? So most of the members are female. Most of the leadership is male. And
Yep.
so one of the things you're getting is the sense of threat to Black masculinity by the presence, existence, acceptance of anyone who doesn't fit into a kind of the limits of being male and female in traditional terms. And so it's seen as a threat to Black masculinity, and we can probably all understand why that threat exists. And then it becomes the kind of the queer community becomes the kind of scapegoat. It becomes part of the sense of we have to protect ourselves from any other difference, and any other difference is a threat to our Blackness.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
No, it's a great question. Thank you.
Very
Thank you.
informative response. I wanted to also say to you that one of my experiences in when I was in college, graduate school, as a matter of fact, caused me to really question why did I have, biases or hesitations or not knowing, if you will, not liking, I'm not sure if I'm gonna use the right word, but the gay, the LGBTQ community and so forth. And I finally just said to myself, like many biases or all biases, some of this stuff is just passed down and taught to some people, and you don't even know why you're believing it until you question yourself and say, and looking at the whole person, the individual, which I'm grateful that that's a part of my life, but it just was so profound for me to say, where is all this prejudice coming from? We collectively are carrying down stuff, and we need to break it up, unpack it. One of the gifts for me as a church-going person is that I've learned I have the freedom to think and question and choose. And we are progressive as people. I don't deny any of what you said, and I really appreciate what you said. But I think as individuals, we need to start questioning. Why am I thinking like that? And as I said, I taught children who had disabilities. And years ago, that was a population that nobody wanted to embrace, and now we've moved to the whole Americans with Disability Act. But at one time, it was you put them aside, you put them away, give them a little corner. And then when you question people, why is it? You begin to you know, break down some of these barriers of, you know, you just didn't know. And then we can begin hopefully to start embracing and loving people just as human beings.
Yes, like Bayard did.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The place this takes us to, and where we will pick up next week, is looking at race also as part of an important part of Bayard's identity, and also an important part of our own society and the way we see people, what we think of when we see Blackness. Also the social and political economic constructions of what it means to be Black and how we even define it. We'll begin with this quote, and we do have a participant who will identify with this. And I use this with my Drew students to say to them, what does race mean if you can simply stamp it on a piece of paper and a person who is identified as Black can become honorary white? What does it mean if a person is Black in America, they're colored in South Africa, they are mulatto in Brazil, and so we can see how these definitions and identities shift depending upon the political, social, and historical context. So we will begin our class on May 7th, looking specifically at race, similar to looking at gender identity and sexual orientation, seeing how race and racism are defined, and look at it in the context of the times in which Bayard lived, of Jim Crow segregation, the evolution of civil rights organizations, which are founded in the early 1900s, but are maturing and changing. And there are a lot of them. We sometimes think of 2 or 3 civil rights organizations, and there are 7 or 8 of them that are national. Thinking about the way the movement itself changes, and Bayard is at the center of absolutely every one of those. Any questions for us? We have a minute, I think.
When do we get our books if we're in Montclair?
They were already, Katie has already sent them out because she had to send them out herself, right? And not from, she personally had to send them out. Yes, she sent them out book rate. So they should arrive.
Okay.
Yeah, they should arrive. I think some people have gotten there, so I'm assuming everyone's probably getting there sometime this week.
You can get it on a Kindle version for $8 or $9 right away. I mean, I did that this morning because I just.
Oh, okay.
It's a very quick read.
Yeah, it's a quick read. This really is a book for for teenagers.
Oh,
so it's 142 pages. So it's a one-day read.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very good.
Yeah, very informative.
Thank you. See you next week.
Presentation. Thank you.
All of you were fabulous. You're the ones who really made the discussion valuable. And I knew it would be a lively discussion and that we would learn from all of you as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
next
Everybody
week.
be safe.
All right,
Yes,
you
stay
too.
safe
Thank you
and
so
have a good
much.
week.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you so
bye-bye.
much.